was an ordinary evening when a young black judge, Lauren, received a call that changed her life forever. Her brother was in the middle of a dangerous incident with the police, and everything that happened next turned their world upside down. Lauren couldn't imagine what lay ahead, but the events of that night were the beginning of something much bigger. Stay tuned to find out what this fatal collision led to and why it shocked the whole city. Watch to the end, and you won't believe how it will turn out. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Please do not regret subscribing. Your subscription strongly motivates me to publish more such stories. Lauren had always been comfortable in the halls of justice, where her word carried weight, and her decisions shaped the lives of those who came before her. But that comfort vanished the moment her phone rang late that evening. She was at her desk, buried in case files, when an unknown number flashed on the screen. Normally, she'd let such calls go to voicemail, but something urged her to answer this one. "Judge Lauren Taylor," the voice on the other end asked, stern and unfamiliar. "Yes, speaking. Who is this?" she replied, already sensing the tension in the caller's tone. "This is Officer Davis, ma'am. We have your brother, Justin Taylor, in custody. He was involved in a car accident, and we're investigating further." Her heart skipped a beat. "Is he okay? What happened?" "We'll explain everything when you get here, ma'am, but he's being detained for questioning." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lauren with a chill running down her spine. Justin, her baby brother, barely 25, always so careful and responsible, couldn't be in serious trouble. Yet the uncertainty and cold detachment in the officer's voice suggested otherwise. Without wasting a second, she grabbed her keys and rushed to her car, speeding through the quiet streets of the city. As she drove, her mind raced through worst-case scenarios. What if Justin was hurt? What if the police mistook him for something he wasn't? She tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing on her role as a protector and a voice of reason, both as a sister and as a judge. When she arrived at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the chaos of the crash site. Justin's car was crumpled at the front, but it was the sight beyond the wreckage that sent a surge of panic through her. Her brother was on the ground, handcuffed, surrounded by 3 officers, one of whom pressed a knee into his back. Justin's face was contorted in pain, his voice barely audible as he struggled to breathe. "Justin," Lauren shouted, rushing towards them. "What the hell is going on here?" One of the officers, a burly man with a stern expression, stepped in front of her. "Stay back, ma'am. This is a police matter." Lauren flashed her credentials, her voice firm but trembling with emotion. "I am Judge Lauren Taylor. That's my brother you're manhandling. I demand to know what's going on." The officer's eyes flickered over her badge, but his stance didn't change. "We don't care who you are, ma'am. This is a crime scene. Your brother's involved in a serious incident, and you need to let us do our job." Lauren's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could see the bruises forming on Justin's face, the pain in his eyes as he tried to meet her gaze. "You're hurting him. He has rights. This is excessive force." Another officer, a woman with a cold, indifferent gaze, spoke up. "Ma'am, if you don't back away, we'll have to consider this interference with police work." Lauren could hardly believe what she was hearing. She'd spent years upholding the law, believing in its ability to protect the innocent. Yet here, on this cold, unforgiving pavement, her authority seemed to mean nothing. She watched as the officers treated her brother like a criminal, disregarding her pleas and refusing to acknowledge her status. For the first time in her career, Lauren felt utterly powerless. Justin winced, his voice barely a whisper. "Lauren, please." Her heart broke at the desperation in his voice. She fought back tears, knowing that any sign of emotion could be used against her in this moment. She needed to remain composed, to find a way through this nightmare. But the officers were relentless, ignoring her every attempt to intervene. One of the bystanders, a middle-aged man with a phone in hand, began recording the scene, capturing the rough treatment Justin endured. But even that did not seem to deter the officers. They ignored the growing crowd, their focus fixed on their target. As they dragged Justin towards a police cruiser, Lauren followed, her mind racing for a way to stop this. "I'll see you in court for this," she warned, her voice low and dangerous. "You're violating his rights, and I won't let this slide." The officer smirked, dismissing her threat with a wave. "Good luck, Judge Taylor." Let's see how much your words matter when we write the reports." Lauren stood there, frozen in a mix of anger and disbelief. As the police car pulled away with Justin inside, the sounds of sirens faded, leaving only the murmur of onlookers and the hum of city life, returning to normal. But for Lauren, nothing felt normal anymore. Her world had shifted, and she knew that what had just happened would change everything. She glanced at the bystander who had filmed the incident, and a small spark of determination lit up within her. If the police thought she would stay silent, they were mistaken. As she watched the car disappear into the night, Lauren made a silent promise to herself and to her brother. She would make sure those responsible answered for their actions, no matter the cost. Lauren could barely sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the image of Justin on the cold pavement, his face pressed against the ground as the officers ignored his pleas. By morning, her determination had only solidified. She hurried to the police station, ready to demand answers and justice. But as soon as she walked through the doors, she sensed the hostility in the air. At the front desk, a young officer glanced up, his expression shifting from polite to guarded when she introduced herself. "I'm here to see my brother, Justin Taylor. I'd like to speak to the officer in charge of his case." The officer eyed her skeptically before making a call. A few minutes later, a familiar face emerged. Officer Davis, the one who had ignored her pleas at the scene. His smirk remained intact, a clear sign that he still did not take her seriously. "Back again, Judge Taylor. I thought we made it clear last night that this is a police matter," Davis said, crossing his arms over his chest. Lauren refused to be intimidated. "I'm here for my brother. I want to see him, and I want to know what charges you've filed against him." Davis shrugged nonchalantly. "He's being held for questioning related to the car accident and potential reckless endangerment. And no, you can't see him right now." Lauren's jaw tightened. "He has the right to an attorney present during questioning. If you continue to deny him access, I will file a complaint against you and your department for violating his rights." Davis's expression turned colder. "Ma'am, if you continue to interfere, you're going to find yourself on the other side of this desk." The threat hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Lauren could feel the stares of other officers, some curious, others outright hostile. But she knew backing down wasn't an option, not after everything they had done to Justin. "I won't be intimidated," she said, holding her head high. "I'm not just Justin's sister. I'm a judge, and I will make sure that due process is followed." Davis leaned closer, his voice a low growl. "That badge doesn't mean anything here, Judge. Out there, you might have some sway, but in this building, you're just another civilian trying to tell us how to do our jobs. So take a seat or leave." Lauren felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation, but she swallowed her pride and did as she was told. She sat in the waiting area, watching as officers passed by, some whispering among themselves while glancing in her direction. The minutes dragged on, turning into hours, and still no one came to update her on Justin's status. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts, contemplating who might be able to help. Her mind raced through names of lawyers, fellow judges, and even reporters she'd met over the years. But each time, a voice in her head reminded her of the risks involving the media could backfire, turning this personal matter into a public spectacle. Just as she was about to make a call, a commotion erupted from the back of the station. 2 officers emerged, roughly dragging Justin between them. He looked disheveled, his face bruised, and his wrists red from the tightness of the handcuffs. He winced with each step, his head hanging low. "Justin?" Lauren jumped up, rushing toward them, but Davis blocked her path once more, his smirk now replaced with a look of irritation. "I told you to sit down," he snapped, shoving her back with enough force to make her stumble. It was then that Lauren realized the scene they were making. Right in the middle of the station, several officers and civilians in the lobby had turned their attention toward them, some even recording on their phones. But instead of backing down, she straightened her shoulders and raised her voice, ensuring that everyone in the room could hear. "This is unlawful. You're violating his rights, and you're going to be held accountable for this," she shouted, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "I'll make sure every one of you faces consequences for this brutality." Davis's face twisted in anger, and for a moment Lauren thought he might try to arrest her. right then and there, but instead he leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "If you think you can scare us with your threats, you're in for a rude awakening, Judge. This is our town, our rules." Lauren stared him down, refusing to show any sign of fear, but inside, she felt the cold grip of helplessness tighten around her heart. Even as a judge, standing in her own community, she was powerless against those who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. It was a bitter realization that she couldn't shake. Justin, barely able to stand, managed to lift his head and meet her gaze. In his eyes, she saw the same fear and uncertainty she felt. Yet, there was also a flicker of hope, a belief that she might be able to do something, anything, to make this right. Lauren clenched her fists, holding back the tears, threatening to spill. She would not break down here, not in front of them. Instead, she took a deep breath and turned away, heading for the exit. But as she stepped outside, the cool air hitting her face, she knew that this was far from over. As she walked to her car, she caught sight of the bystander from the night before, the one who had filmed the scene at the crash site. He approached her cautiously, holding up his phone. "I've got the whole thing recorded, Judge. What they did to your brother, what they did to you. If you need this, I'm willing to help." Lauren stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. It wasn't just about proving her brother's innocence anymore. It was about exposing the system that had stripped them both of their dignity. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the battle ahead. "Send me the footage," she said, determination burning in her chest. "We're going to make sure they pay for what they've done." With the video in hand and a newfound resolve, Lauren knew that the real fight was just beginning. But as she prepared to face whatever came next, she couldn't shake the lingering fear of what she might lose along the way. Lauren spent the next few days poring over every detail of Justin's case, gathering all the evidence she could find. Her mind was a whirlwind of legal arguments and potential outcomes, but a heavy sense of dread settled in her chest. She knew she was up against more than just the police officers who had mistreated her brother. She was challenging a system that had long operated without accountability. The footage from the bystander became her strongest weapon. It clearly showed the moment when the officers ignored her status as a judge, rough-handled Justin, and treated her with open hostility. She replayed the video countless times, analyzing every second, every frame, searching for anything that could strengthen her case. The injustice of it all only fueled her resolve. But as she prepared for the battle ahead, she began receiving thinly veiled warnings from colleagues. Some were subtle, like Judge Reynolds, a senior judge she'd often looked up to, who pulled her aside after a meeting. "Lauren, you know how these things go," he said in a low voice. "Pushing too hard against the police, it's not always worth it. Just think about your career, your future." She forced a smile, but inside, anger bubbled. "I appreciate the concern, Judge Reynolds, but I won't ignore what they did to my brother. This is personal." He sighed, shaking his head. "Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment, Lauren. Sometimes it's better to let things go." As she walked away, his words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't bring herself to follow his advice. Letting it go would mean accepting that the system could abuse its power without consequence. It would mean abandoning Justin when he needed her most, and that was something she simply couldn't do. Her determination led her to meet with potential allies, lawyers willing to take on the case pro bono, and activists who had seen similar abuses firsthand. They shared their stories, painting a picture of a system that routinely crushed those who tried to stand up against it. It was daunting, but it also reassured Lauren that she wasn't alone in this fight. Meanwhile, Justin's condition remained grim. He had been released from police custody, but with a long list of charges against him: reckless endangerment, resisting arrest, even assaulting an officer. The sight of his bruised face and the haunted look in his eyes cut deeper than any insult the police could hurl at her. Lauren visited him daily, sitting by his side, promising that she would make things right. "They won't get away with this, Justin," she whispered one evening, squeezing his hand. "I'll make sure they face justice." Justin looked up at her, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. "I believe you, sis, but just be careful. They don't play fair." The warning hung heavy between them. Lauren knew he was right. The deeper she delved into the case, the more resistance she encountered. Police reports were altered to paint Justin as the aggressor, with officers claiming he had resisted arrest from the start. Witnesses she tried to reach out to suddenly became unavailable, unwilling to speak against the police. It was clear that those in power were closing ranks, determined to bury the truth. Yet amidst the setbacks, there were small victories. The bystander who had recorded the footage remained steadfast, agreeing to testify if needed, and a few other community members who had witnessed the scene came forward, offering their support. These glimmers of hope kept her going, even when it felt like she was standing alone against a towering wall of corruption. But then came the threats, late-night phone calls from anonymous numbers, ominous notes slipped under her door, warning her to drop the case for her own good. One morning, she found her car window smashed, a crude message scrawled across the dashboard. "Stay in your lane, Judge." The intimidation tactics were designed to shake her, but they only served to strengthen her resolve. Lauren took the broken glass as a symbol of how far the system would go to maintain its power, and how far she was willing to go to challenge it. She documented every threat, every act of vandalism, building her own case, even as she prepared for Justin's defense. Her home turned into a war room, with files and notes scattered across the dining table, and the walls covered with legal strategies and timelines. Late one night, as she sat alone, she received a call from one of the lawyers she'd consulted with. "Lauren, I've been looking into the officers involved in your brother's case, Davis and the others. They've got a history of complaints against them. Excessive force, misconduct, racial profiling. Most of it's been swept under the rug." Lauren's heart quickened. "Can we use that in court? Can we expose them for what they've done?" The lawyer's voice softened. "It won't be easy. The department's got its own way of burying these things. But if you're willing to take the risk, we can make this public. It might turn the tide." She leaned back in her chair, staring at the chaotic mess of papers around her. This was her chance, a way to shift the narrative, to show that this wasn't just about Justin, but about a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for too long. But she also knew the cost. Going public would mean risking not just her career, but her safety and that of her family. After a long pause, she made up her mind. "Do it," she said, her voice steady. "I'll handle the fallout." The next morning, headlines broke the story of the brutal arrest, the video footage, and the pattern of complaints against the officers. The city buzzed with reactions, some furious, others supportive, but all of them watching closely as Lauren prepared to go head-to-head with the police department. Lauren's phone buzzed with messages, some from colleagues offering quiet support, others expressing their disappointment and concern. But amidst the chaos, she found a sense of clarity. She wasn't just fighting for Justin anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, every victim who hadn't had the chance to seek justice. As she stood on the steps of the courthouse, ready to face the storm she had unleashed, Lauren knew there was no turning back. And though the weight of the battle ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders, she held her head high, determined to see it through, no matter what came next. The courtroom was packed. On the day of Justin's hearing, a tension-filled silence hanging over the room. As Lauren took her seat, she had spent every waking hour preparing for this moment, reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement. But as she glanced around the room, she saw the eyes of those who doubted her, who hoped she would fail. It was clear that she had become a target for challenging the system, and today was the day that would determine if her efforts had been worth it. Justin sat beside her, his face pale but determined, the bruises on his skin a harsh reminder of the abuse he had suffered. Across the aisle, Officer Davis and his colleagues sat with their lawyer, their expressions smug and unyielding. Lauren knew that their confidence came from years of getting away with mistreatment, but she was prepared to change that. The prosecutor, a stern man with a reputation for siding with law enforcement, stood first. He outlined the charges against Justin in a calm, methodical voice, painting a picture of a reckless young man who had endangered lives and resisted arrest. Lauren clenched her fists under the table, but she kept her expression neutral, knowing that her time would come. When it was her turn, she rose, taking a deep breath before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, what happened to my brother that night was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of excessive force and abuse of power by those who were supposed to protect him." She played the footage, captured by the bystander. The video showing the officers dragging Justin out of his car, ignoring his pleas, and rough-handling him, despite his clear compliance. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the video played, the sound of Justin's pained cries echoing through the room. Lauren watched as the judge's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the rough treatment. The prosecutor jumped in, trying to dismiss the video as misleading. "This footage is taken out of context, Your Honor." The officers were following standard procedures, given the potential threat they faced. Lauren countered, her voice sharp. "Threat? My brother posed no threat, and the video shows that clearly." The officers refused to acknowledge his rights and treated him with brutality. "If this is standard procedure, then we have a serious problem with our standards." She called her first witness, one of the few brave enough to come forward, a middle-aged woman who had been driving by the scene that night. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but she confirmed that Justin had been compliant and that the officers had ignored Lauren's pleas as a judge. Her testimony painted a picture that directly contradicted the police reports. As the cross-examination began, the prosecutor tried to discredit her, pointing out inconsistencies in her statement and suggesting that she might have been too far away to see clearly. The woman faltered, but Lauren quickly stepped in, redirecting the focus to the evidence at hand. It was a battle of words and tactics, with every point Lauren made met with resistance from the prosecution. Hours passed, and Lauren felt the weight of every moment. She knew that winning this case wouldn't just be about proving Justin's innocence. It would be about exposing the corruption and prejudice that had tainted the entire process. But as the hearing continued, she couldn't ignore the exhaustion in Justin's eyes or the frustration building in her chest. Then came the moment she had been waiting for. Lauren called the bystander who had recorded the footage, and he took the stand, holding his phone as if it were a shield. He described the scene in detail, confirming that the officers had treated Justin with unnecessary force. Even after it was clear he posed no danger, his testimony was clear, precise, and damning. The prosecutor tried to undermine him, accusing him of bias and questioning his motives for recording the video in the first place. "Isn't it true that you have a history of antagonizing the police?" the prosecutor asked, his tone dripping with disdain. The bystander met his gaze without flinching. "I record what I see when people are being treated unfairly. That night, I saw a man being brutalized by officers who didn't care who was watching. If that makes me an antagonist, then so be it." Lauren felt a surge of hope as the courtroom buzzed with whispers. The bystander's words resonated, cutting through the polished arguments of the prosecution, but she knew that the fight wasn't over yet. Next, she turned her attention to Officer Davis. He took the stand, his expression defiant. She pressed him with questions, exposing contradictions between his testimony and the video evidence. Davis grew defensive, his answers clipped, but Lauren continued, her voice calm but relentless. "You claim my brother was aggressive and uncooperative, yet the video shows him complying with every order. How do you explain that discrepancy, Officer Davis?" she asked, her tone pointed. Davis shifted in his seat, his composure faltering. "The video doesn't show everything. We had reason to believe he was dangerous." Lauren leaned in, her eyes never leaving his. "But you never found any evidence of a weapon, did you, officer? And you ignored my requests as a judge to respect his rights, correct?" Silence filled the courtroom, and for the first time, Davis hesitated. His lawyer tried to intervene, objecting to Lauren's line of questioning, but the damage was done. The cracks in the officer's story were becoming impossible to ignore. Lauren felt the tide turning. She presented reports of past complaints against Davis and his colleagues, revealing a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture. The courtroom watched in tense silence as she laid out her case, piece by piece, until the full weight of the truth became undeniable. The judge called for a recess, and as the courtroom emptied, Lauren caught sight of Davis's lawyer, whispering urgently in his ear. Justin squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope that she hadn't seen in weeks. "Thank you, Lauren," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Lauren managed a small smile, though her mind remained focused on what was to come. "We're not done yet, Justin, but we're closer than we were before." The break felt like an eternity. But when the judge returned, his expression was stern. He addressed the courtroom, his voice carrying a gravity that filled every corner of the room. Based on the evidence presented, it is clear that there are serious questions about the conduct of the officers involved in this case. This court finds that the charges against Justin Taylor are unfounded, and I am ordering a full review of the arresting officer's actions that night. A wave of relief washed over Lauren, and she felt Justin's hand tighten around hers. The tension in the room broke, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. But she knew this was only the beginning. While Justin had been exonerated, the fight to hold the officers accountable was far from over. As the courtroom emptied, Lauren caught sight of Davis's glare, the fury in his eyes promising that he wouldn't let this go easily. But she met his stare with unwavering determination. He might have thought he could break her, but he was wrong. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, but Lauren focused on Justin, guiding him through the crowd and into the safety of her car. As they drove away, the city's skyline stretched before them, a reminder of the battle still to come. "We did it, Justin," she said quietly, glancing at him with a tired smile. "But now, it's time to make sure they can't do this to anyone else." Justin nodded, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. "I know you will, sis. I believe in you." Lauren's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she drove toward home, a new resolve burning in her chest. She had won this round, but the war for justice was far from over, and she was ready for whatever came next. The news of Justin's exoneration and the investigation into the officers spread quickly. It was a victory, but for Lauren, it felt more like the start of a new battle. As the city erupted with mixed reactions, some praising her courage, others accusing her of overstepping, she faced a wave of consequences that tested her resolve. She returned to her office the day after the verdict, finding an envelope waiting for her on her desk. It contained a letter from the State Judiciary Board, calling her actions during the case into question. The message was clear. Her stance against the police had not gone unnoticed, and now her career was under scrutiny. They questioned whether her involvement in Justin's defense constituted a conflict of interest, hinting at potential disciplinary actions. Lauren took a deep breath, crumpling the letter in her fist. It was no surprise. They were trying to undermine her, to push her back into line, but she refused to be intimidated. She knew that standing up for Justin was the right thing to do, and she wouldn't let them erase that. She called a press conference that afternoon, standing before the flashing cameras with a calm determination. "This is not just about my brother," she told the assembled reporters. "It's about a system that allows power to be abused without consequence. I took a stand because I believe that no one, no matter their position, should be above the law." Her words resonated with many, but they also stirred up a storm. Backlash from the police union was swift. They painted her as a biased judge who couldn't separate her personal life from her professional responsibilities. Anonymous threats flooded her inbox, warning her to back off or face the consequences. Lauren's colleagues grew distant. Conversations that used to flow easily became strained, their smiles replaced with forced politeness. Some even avoided her in the halls. It was clear that many in the judiciary didn't want to be associated with her now controversial reputation. But amidst the isolation, she found unexpected allies, people who shared her belief in accountability and fairness, who encouraged her to continue the fight. Justin, meanwhile, tried to piece his life back together. The trauma of the arrest lingered, but he found support among those who had seen the footage, who understood what he had endured. He joined community meetings, sharing his story and calling for reform. Seeing him find a purpose in the aftermath gave Lauren a renewed sense of hope, even as her own future remained uncertain. Then, one night, just as she was locking up her office, she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Officer Davis standing there, his face shadowed in the dim light of the hallway. Lauren's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stand tall, refusing to show any sign of fear. "What do you want, Davis?" she asked, her voice cold. He looked different. Gone was the smug arrogance she had seen in court. Instead, he seemed almost defeated, a desperate edge in his voice. "I need to talk to you." She crossed her arms, keeping her distance. "You've had your chance to talk. Now it's my turn to make sure you face the consequences of your actions." Davis shifted uneasily, his eyes darting around the empty hallway. You think I don't know that? Look, I messed up, okay? But they're using me as a scapegoat. The department, they're throwing me under the bus to protect themselves." Lauren raised an eyebrow, skepticism clear in her expression. "And I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? You and your colleagues brutalized my brother, and you think I care that they're turning on you now?" Davis took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't get it. They're covering up a lot more than what happened to your brother. They're trying to silence anyone who gets in their way, including you. If you keep pushing, they'll make sure you lose everything." Lauren stared at him, a mix of anger and curiosity bubbling inside her. She knew that Davis was trying to save himself, but there was a kernel of truth in his words. The threats, the isolation, the pressure from the Judiciary Board, it all pointed to a larger effort to protect the status quo. "I'm not backing down, Davis," she said firmly. "If they think they can scare me into silence, they're wrong. I'll expose every lie, every cover-up, and I'll make sure the truth comes out." Davis let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "You've got guts, Judge. I'll give you that. But I hope you know what you're getting into." With that, he turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Lauren alone in the darkness. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. She gathered her files, the evidence she had compiled, and began drafting her statement for the Judiciary Board. She would defend her actions and make her case for why she had to stand up against the abuse of power. The next morning, she submitted her statement, knowing that it could be the end of her career as a judge. But as she watched Justin and others who had suffered under the same system find their voice, she realized that some sacrifices were worth making. A week later, the board held a hearing to decide her fate. Reporters crowded the steps of the courthouse, waiting for a decision that could set a precedent for judges across the state. Inside, Lauren stood before the panel, meeting their questioning gazes with unwavering confidence. She spoke about the duty of the judiciary to hold power accountable, about her responsibility, not just as a sister, but as a judge to uphold justice. In the end, the board ruled to censure her, a formal reprimand that would remain on her record, but allowed her to keep her position. It was a bittersweet victory, but Lauren accepted it with a sense of pride. She had stood her ground, and even though she bore the scars of the battle, she knew she had made a difference. As she left the courthouse, a crowd of supporters gathered outside, holding signs demanding justice for Justin and accountability for the police. Among them, she saw Justin, his face bright with pride and gratitude. He stepped forward, wrapping her in a tight hug, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe freely. "We did it, Lauren," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it." She smiled, holding back tears. "We're not done yet, but at least we've taken the first step." Together, they walked through the crowd, surrounded by people who had been inspired by their fight. And as Lauren looked out at the faces of those who believed in change, she knew that the struggle for justice would continue. But for now, she allowed herself to feel the weight lift from her shoulders, even if just for a moment. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with new challenges and risks. But as Lauren held her brother's hand, she felt a sense of purpose that would guide her through whatever came next. She had faced the system, risked everything, and though the battle had taken its toll, she had emerged stronger, and she would keep fighting until the day when justice was not just a word, but a reality for everyone. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new videos with equally gripping stories. Your opinion matters, so let me know in the comments what you think about this situation. What would you have done in Lauren's place? And feel free to share your own stories. I read all your comments. Also, don't forget to check out other videos on the channel. Each one will reveal new sides of the fight for justice. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.